Byron felt relief nearly an hour ago when they'd finally cast their horses off, tying them to a tree at the edge of the woods. 4 days of real hard travel across desert land had left Byron, Varek, and Elisbeth with little energy to keep up the pursuit of whoever was attacking these refugees. They did their best, but their pace never exceeded a walk. Elisbeth had shown one of her other talents. Despite being blind, she perceived things using small, unseen energy bursts from her hands. It turned out she could also see decaying energy that came from shepherds using their abilities.
So, what's it like when you see it?
It's like a burst of color. I see most things in a soft red or pink, but this is like a hanging blue.
So, there's a difference?
Yes.
The question is, can we figure out how to track the people responsible?
That should be simple if they are still in a state of using their power. Even if they don't use energy, it'll leave a heat trail. I just have to alter my perception.
Byron appreciated Elisabeth's abilities insofar as it meant that they weren't going blindly through the forest, tracking a target they knew nothing about. The irony wasn't lost on him as he bit back a laugh while they continued their trek into the woods. There had been recent physical tracks of a wagon that all three of them had agreed must hold more refugees, but probably not the ones related to the refugees who had made it all the way to Fort William. Varek had suggested that this meant a serious operation by Jaken and that these shepherds were stationed somewhere in the woods. It would make it easier for them to pick off an unsuspecting caravan in the woods, where it would be much harder to mount a decent defense. These woods had very few open clearings, and so the trees were cover.
I don't think they would be on this end here. They'll probably be around the other edge or third of the forest. No sense in picking off a target right here on this edge, where an escape is easily achieved.
Thank you, Captain Obvious.
I'm just preparing myself for a lot more walking. Guess I was thinking out loud.
Yeah, well, I didn't need that pick-me-up.
Sorry.
They walked several miles before setting up camp. Elisabeth worried about the horses, but Varek assured her they could escape if necessary and had enough food left for a couple of days. Varek remembered his journey through these very woods 5 years ago. He was in a very broken state, and the only thing he truly remembered was the smell and color. Formations and detail escaped him. They all shared a cramped tent, as a light load of supplies was desirable for fast travel. They ate in silence, keeping a low fire to prevent an easy signal for possible ambush. As they all lay in the tent, uncomfortably close, the silence was almost palpable. Elisabeth, who did not like silence at all, squirmed and struggled to find peace as she lay in the tent. 5 days of this, Ben owed her. Big time. None of the three felt the need for a watch as the encampment sat at the bottom of a ravine. However, like most nights, Byron woke first. Insomnia was a constant companion of his heavy mind. Once any light burst over the horizon, like a loud beacon, Byron found that he had to answer it. He climbed quietly from the tent so as not to disturb his companions and stood, not really registering any of his senses. Byron didn't remember when it had become so hard to sleep. He always reacted to the need to wake up with helpless acceptance. He fought the sleep some days, but mostly it was a useless endeavor. Byron breathed in the cool air as he surveyed his surroundings. The quiet was a little comfort. They would be hunting once again for the group that was picking up refugees. Despite the impending conflict, Byron found it, as often was the case with silence, he had trouble reining in his thoughts.
Byron snapped to attention when he heard the crack of a branch. He quickly turned back to the opening of the tent.
Closing the distance in a few steps, he pulled open the flap.
You both need to wake up, now. There's movement beyond the trees.
Byron turned back to the area where the noise had originated. He heard the fumbling of his companions in the tent as they scrambled to get up and grab their weapons. Varek was the first to emerge from the tent.
If this was an animal, so help me, Byron, I will make you regret it.
It was too big to be an animal.
It was too big to be an animal.
Elisbeth was the next to emerge. She was settling a dagger in its sheath and came up beside Varek.
What's happening?
His Royalness heard a noise.
Elisbeth immediately opened her senses to track anyone with power like theirs.
Well, it seems like he wasn't wrong.
What do you see?
20 or so people, all coming from the same direction, all shepherds.
Only good news might be they're only attacking from one direction. Amateurs.
Even if that's true, they vastly outnumber us.
They're moving slowly as if they know we're here. What they don't know is we know they're here.
What should we do?
I'm not concerned. If they're not well trained, there's a good chance we can overmatch them.
That's a huge guess, Varek. I just met you. I don't have a read on your capability as a strategist.
Can you fight?
Gee, I wonder if the blind girl can fight suddenly at the last minute because I'm a giant idiot who didn't think to ask before we went on this possible combat operation.
She faced Varek angrily, her pure white eyes even more stark behind an angry expression.
Yes, I can fight.
Cutting him off before he could respond.
And defend myself. It's still just past dawn, so I have a stronger advantage.
How can you tell what time of day it is?
Because the sun is warm, you slobbering dip.
Whoa! Hey, can we stop this, please? There's sort of like, 20 shepherds looking to kill us?
Byron walked over beside Elisbeth.
Orin, listen. I don't want you to engage unless attacked. I need your senses to let us know the battle situation. You're the only one that spotted...
I got it. Shh. They're closing in.
Byron checked his armor fitting and began the pour, feeling his muscles tighten, tendons stretch, and bones harden.
Divide and conquer, Baron. Don't let them roll over us. We don't know their abilities, but I sincerely doubt they have much combat experience against our kind.
Byron nodded, and then focusing back where he originally heard the noise that alerted them, he saw figures begin to rush forth from the trees, making their way down the ravine.
Byron, no questions now. None of these people can escape. We kill them, no one can know we were here.
Byron didn't respond because he didn't need to. Being told he had to kill was easier than just deciding himself he had to kill. In a sense, he could blame the situation on Varek. It wasn't like with Zeke in Oberon, where he'd had to make the choice himself. He didn't want the responsibility. Varek was never too keen on letting the enemy dictate the pace of an encounter. But he knew an aggressive attack might get them surrounded. The three of them ducked down, shielding themselves behind their tent, and waited for a chance to attack the incoming unsuspecting enemy.
They're on the other side. About 7 of them.
Varek pointed directions for Byron to flank them and then stood up. His sword sat almost non-threatening in his grip. Byron began to circle around and prepare for the flank, as Varek moved to draw their attention.
Hello there. Sneaking up on a camp, I see. Your master could have at least taught you how to flank your enemy to minimize the counterattack.
Byron took the cue flawlessly, snapping a man's neck and quickly striking 2 others. Just like that, they were in a fight for their lives. Varek managed to stab another guy in the chest and kick him off the end of one of his swords.
Oh my god! It's him!
Byron stopped what he was doing. The attackers stopped when one of them looked in fear at Rally Varek.
It's the Black Death!
Byron looked at his bodyguard's face as the man spun his sword in a single rotation to settle them. Varek's face was pure rage at the mention of this name.
You're really going to wish that you hadn't said that.
3 men dead, 2 injured after Byron pummeled them. That left just 2. The 2 uninjured began to run to their remaining forces at the top of the ravine, but hadn't gotten more than a few steps from the bottom of it before Rally's sword stabbed into their backs and out through their chests. Byron dealt with the 2 injured men. One staggered backward, away, as Byron continued his advance.
You're never gonna smile right again.
The man made a feeble attempt to throw a punch, but Byron easily caught the blow, snapped the wrist, exposing the bone and then releasing the wrist. He then punched his enemy in the throat before the man could even attempt a sound. The brutality didn't even register to Byron as he focused on the other man, whose cheek had been crushed by his punch.
No, please, don't!
Byron showed no sign that he'd heard the plea. He simply swung a hard fist into the man's chest, stopping his heart. It was after this that Byron realized something wasn't right about this. These men were unarmed and hadn't even used any powers on them. Elisbeth came out from her spot by the tent, and she and Byron ran the 20 yards to catch up to where Varek was still at the bottom of the ravine.
Something isn't right about this.
I know, kid. I thought you said there were 20 of them.
There are. I can't discern distance accurately here. The trees distort how I see some things.
Alright. Well, that changes some things. These guys didn't use powers. This was a scouting group. I checked them. They had daggers and nothing else. Probably the most inexperienced of their group. Gauge for possible threats from a distance. Smart.
You don't think they're human, do you?
No. Jaken doesn't work with humans at all under any circumstance.
So what does the rest of it mean? What are the others doing?
I intend to find out.
Well, they aren't scrambling away. They'll be entrenched above us.
They'll have a small advantage, and these will be slightly better trained shepherds. Elisbeth, you're up now. No more recon.
I hate this guy.
I didn't catch that.
Nothing. Totally on board with your plan. Go team and other inspiring comments.
The trio quickly climbed up the side of the ravine, knowing full well the likely dangers in front of them. Varek neared the top of the ravine first and reached down both hands, one for each companion, and pulled them up with moderate effort. They had no time to settle on their new ground as Elisbeth cut the tension with a warning.
Here they come.
Byron, you take left, I'll take the right.
Oren, cover us. If anything goes wrong, you still see more than we do.
I don't think that will help.
Why not?
Several of these people use energy. I can see them pushing it out of their bodies. You're gonna need me.
How can you help?
I can use my powers to scramble their senses on a broad scale. Like a bomb, I can radiate it out rather than the controlled.
Attacks began as Byron, Varek, and Elisbeth were all greeted uncomfortably close to the ravine they'd just climbed.
Rather than a controlled burst from my hands, it should give you an advantage while they're off balance. The only problem is I'll be completely blind for several hours afterwards. All my other senses will be dulled as well.
What do you need?
Only a minute.
Elisbeth turned her concentration on repelling her current attacker as she saw a shepherd begin a ranged attack. She spun her opponent around in a smooth, easy motion as she drew a crescent blade across the man's throat, killing him instantly. She guided her allies to a good spot for cover and had already begun the process of securing the energy for her attack. Byron and Varek regrouped. There were still a dozen shepherds out there. This wasn't going to be easy, even if Elisabeth's plan worked.
I'm going to cover her. Don't back me up, and don't get close.
This is Arkneo Masato, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
Byron watched as Varek took off his gloves, something he didn't even remember Varek doing before. Byron's eyes froze on the hands with thick blackened veins and painful skin breaks and colors that looked like rot. Byron nearly gagged, watching them work to put the gloves in Varek's jacket pocket. It looked like they might fall apart. These guys were definitely amateurs, Varek thought as he stood there ready to reveal himself. He would take any advantage granted in battle, especially an inexperienced enemy. Byron watched as another bolt of what looked like blue lightning hit Varek. No, it didn't hit him. It hit his hand and disappeared. The veins on his hands began to glow green. Varek made a fist, and then, in a forceful push motion, he threw a bolt of his own. He did this 2 more times. Byron stood. Elisbeth would be ready soon.
Incoming!
In a sudden wave of invisible energy, everyone, including her allies, was dizzy and unable to see well or balance. The only one mostly unaffected was Byron, who'd trained a bunch in altered states. Cass was thorough about Byron's training, and he was starting to appreciate it now. Though his senses were dulled, his balance was steeled by altering how he perceived it. Instead of his inner ear, he focused on his feet, and this worked just well enough for him to mount a small offensive against his less than capable counterparts. He had increased his strength a bit more, and now using just one well-placed blow, began attacking the shepherds who dared round up humans for Jaken. After 5 of them went down at his hands, Byron noticed a man stand up almost as if he'd been inside the ground. He heard popping and then groans. Within 20 seconds, Byron knew he was in trouble.
You've made a mistake coming here, Varek. You and your friends will all die!
The man Byron assumed was the leader was no longer a human form. He had transformed himself into some kind of tree golem.
Oh.
Varek had made his way back to Elisbeth, thanking the heavens silently that they were further from the ravine. He choked back the need to vomit from the overwhelming dizziness. Elisbeth crouched against the trees, shielding her presence. Varek wondered if she had indeed been deprived of her senses. Before he could ask her anything, though, he heard a loud bang and turned quickly, almost vomiting again. He saw Byron's form crumpled against a now fallen tree. Varek heard Byron moan in agony as he attempted to stand. Several loud pops told Varek that Byron's ability to heal was in overdrive. Byron couldn't stand despite his best efforts. Varek watched as the boy struggled to all fours, and his back cracked loudly as Varek felt empathy pains wash over him.
Hold on, Byron. I'll back you up.
No! Stay back!
Varek's instinct would have been to ignore a command that seemed foolish. But the way Byron had sounded just then froze him in place. Byron seemed frightened, but not for himself. Varek wondered what the boy had seen or been attacked by. As his mind cleared, he turned back to Elisbeth.
Are you all right?
Yes. My powers, they went off too soon. I was distracted. Sorry.
Can you see?
Yes, but barely.
Byron stood, now healed enough to move normally. He was pouring more energy into his body and feeling the muscles and skin stretch. Byron also pushed his pains into the corner of his mind. Now the only thing in his mind was stopping whatever the shepherd was before he could get a shot in on either one of his allies. If this man landed any shots against those two, they would die easily.
Okay, my turn.
Byron didn't approach cautiously. Instead, he opted for a burst of speed and avoided the large arms that reached out to grab him. Byron was not thinking normally now. In this state, he was just thinking about keeping this thing, whatever kind of shepherd this was, away from his friends. A swing missed his head, and Byron exploded with as much force as he could pack behind his blows. He swung once, hitting the golem in the chest. Then he went for each knee, forcing it to kneel. The creature looked surprised that this small kid could pack such a punch. Byron only heard its pants of pain. This spurred him on. Meanwhile, Varek had lifted Elisbeth off the ground and was walking them from the trees at her request. Concern for Byron had them both curious, as they only heard the cracks of blows being landed. As they came out from behind the trees that had shielded them, they were both stunned by the size of the creature Byron was laying blows into.
He's gonna need your help, Varek. He's losing steam.
As she finished her assessment of the fight they were witnessing, they watched in horror as one of the tree trunk arms came up alongside Byron's left arm, and large, long, branch-like fingers shot out and pierced the arm. The scream they heard froze them in place.
Ah!
Byron's senses momentarily lost as the pain shot through him. He didn't know his skin could be pierced, let alone by wood. He felt the tendrils snaking in and tearing his muscles. He couldn't react. The pain was so extreme, it was the only thing his body was capable of processing. Varek sprang into action. Once again, he removed his gloves after setting Elisbeth down roughly.
Shh! Hang on, kid, I'm coming!
Varek's hands felt as though they were rolled in glass. He always felt that, though. It was nothing new. He ignored his pain as he flexed his hands. Varek circled around his opponent, who was a little too engaged with his current opponent to take notice. Varek felt the strain of adrenaline pushing him on as he closed in behind the thing. When he was about a foot away, he saw the golem twitch, and without a second thought, Varek reached out and grabbed what appeared to be the thing's neck with both hands and began to pull on its life force. Once engaged in the drain, a victim could rarely move or fight. As more energy flowed from the creature, Varek felt his hands heal and energy flow into him.
So much! Too much! Can't!
Varek managed to free himself despite the desire to continue holding on. Varek's body could overload. He knew that. Varek had felt the painful tingling sensation as the energy settled in his cells and healed any and all of his injuries. When he'd done this to Zeke, there was almost nothing left to take, and the last time he'd fed on this much energy was months ago. Byron felt the arms stabbing through his weakened body. He mentally steeled himself and yanked it free. The blood rush was so sudden he almost passed out, but an instant later his exceptional healing power began to close the wounds. Byron clasped his hands together and bashed the slave leader in the face as hard as he could. Then, with the body toppled over, he knelt down on its chest and punched it with as much force and for as many blows as he could.
Easy, kid. Easy. The other 5 guys got away. We'll have to tail them.
Byron obeyed wordlessly. He was exhausted, but the rush of adrenaline had spurred him on. It still was. The sheet of fresh sweat on his face was the only indication he had been under any physical strain.
I can still track them. All things being even, everything is coming up Elisbeth right now.
Where?
Northwest. This way. Follow me.
All 3 of them ran in that direction, not sure what to make of what they'd be running into. Byron kept pace by sheer will. He was being betrayed by his earlier injury and the fading adrenaline. When they reached an encampment, they slowed and stood behind some trees and observed.
Jaken never prepared us for this.
Oh my god, we're so dead!
Shepherds?
As the 3 allies watched the panic of their fleeing enemies, Varek began speaking instructions, most of which Byron didn't hear, except for the order to stay there and let he and Elisbeth secure the camp. Byron nodded his response, and then watched as the 2 crept into the camp. Orin killed the first one with a knife to the throat. Varek drew his sword across the other one's throat. Amateurs, Byron thought to himself. They hadn't even set up a watch to make sure they were not pursued. Byron was glad, but also a little dismayed at how little these men seemed to understand the battle at all. When Byron saw the last man fall, he walked carefully into the camp. There were no others, and all 3 realized what had drawn these slaves back here. There was a 12-foot cart lined on either side with people. Dawn had now become a full sunrise, and they could see the desperate faces of the captive humans. 2 horses were attached to the front of the cart, which was good. Varek began directing traffic to begin the next phase of whatever mission this was. None of them had even considered a live group they would need to transport. Varek cursed at himself. They would have to improvise, including finding food and make camp. Nearly a 4-day trip would now last almost twice as long. Byron was ordered to check on the captives and ease their fears. Though his body was exhausted, he pushed on through the now blurred vision that beckoned him to just stop and lie down. If he was truly honest, he was afraid that he would die now, just like Cass had, despite easing out of his power as they neared the encampment.
As Byron was checking on everyone, he was directed to the back of the cart by an older woman. He was glad he was shorter, as the iron cage sitting on the cart was cramped. As he closed in on a woman whose face was marked with dried tears, he made sure he spoke gently.
What's wrong?
The woman didn't answer,
and a short 10 seconds elapsed before someone else answered him.
Her baby died. She had no means to feed him. We've gone a few days without food.
Byron looked closer and noticed, for the first time, a small form wrapped entirely in cloth. He looked at her again, empathizing, and figuring she might have wailed if she had more strength, but only wept quietly.
Will you let me take him?
It was all Byron could think to say, and he felt so heartless. They were already weak as it was, and a body was a breeding ground for disease. It's what he remembered his father telling him when he was just a little younger. The woman looked at Byron, whose expression of kindness hid the horror and anguish he felt just then. Without a word, or perhaps even the means to argue, she handed him the body of her baby son. The weight was a strange sensation. It caused him to have a morbid curiosity as he walked back in his crouch, the creaking wood of the wagon the only sound being uttered. He couldn't stop the building feeling inside him. He peeled back the blanket and immediately turned away, eyes closed.
Byron, let me take care of this.
Byron Hayne held out the baby's body. As he felt the weight go, he remembered his master dying in his arms weeks ago. He wiped his brow. Then he heard a laugh. It was so out of place, Byron thought he had imagined it, until one of the men they'd supposedly slain gurgled and then spoke.
Jaken will be free soon. You'll all die. That was the last batch for him. This is the end. You're too late. Varek, you're working for the other side now. Still a lapdog wherever you are, right?
The man's eyes were closed, so he never saw Byron jump down from the edge of the cart or close the distance with him. He didn't notice until Byron had gotten down on his knees behind the man and settled one of his arms across the man's neck and put the other across his forehead. He did wonder why the man had mentioned Varek, but he didn't really care about that right now.
It's a shame you won't live to see it.
A snap of the man's head to the right, and he broke his neck.
No witnesses.
It took everything Byron had, physically and mentally, to get back on his feet. Byron staggered to the cart and managed to hang on to the bar near the door. He didn't even have a chance to call out, as the world spun and his fingers betrayed him and unclenched themselves from the bar. He lost his senses before he ever hit the ground.
This is writer-director Joshua Kasperek, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
Several days later, at Fort William. Varek didn't need this. He'd just extracted refugees and gotten everyone nearly home before Benjamin Hayne and Tyrus Clade had shown up as a rescue effort. He was annoyed with it all, but now, Benjamin was making it really hard for Varek not to hit him.
You don't get to say this now. We were all pushed here because you saw things. You put us on this path. You don't get to have regrets or concerns.
You don't get it. What I brought you here for was to protect him, and you couldn't even do that.
Benjamin, stop, right now.
He's so important. You have no idea. It goes way beyond your petty revenge.
Maybe it does. But he asked to go out there, Benjamin. I'm not telling him no, and this was a good play.
A good play? If you knew the weight.
Fuck off, Benjamin. You've shared all the vagaries of your visions. I'm sick of it. I made a call. Everyone's fine. Get off this horse before I knock you off it.
Good luck.
Byron woke with a start. He was still in the medical quarters. It had been a couple of days since he'd come back to the fort, but he still felt a little weary. He'd used a lot of his power, and as a result, his body ached in every way it could. He drew himself up to the side of the bed and noticed he was wearing a bedgown. Feeling a little exposed, he looked around for his clothes. Despite the pain, he really wanted to get up and walk. The smell of a fresh fall rain beckoned him. The door to his room opened, and Byron smiled as Raleigh Varek entered the room. The man seemed to be fuller of life than before.
Good late morning, Byron. You look much better.
Thanks.
Varek sat down beside Byron and let out a breath before speaking again.
I have a secret to share with you.
Byron suspected this was how those men had known him back in the forest. A good thing, since he wanted to know exactly what was the story.
I'm not a shepherd, Byron. I am a twisted human. Jaken made me this way nearly 65 years ago. You see, I was there when he declared his war of extinction on humanity, and I helped him wage it.